Hi, everybody. It's Mary Rowe from the Canadian Urban Institute. On a pretty somber day, I guess this is a day of acknowledgement and remembrance of the people that have actually died or contracted COVID in a serious way and will live with the effects of it, and all the families across the country that will continue to grieve the loss of a loved one or the particular experience they've had providing care, or the pressures they may have experienced, or the dislocation they may have had from their community or from their employment and their livelihood. This is a year like no other, and we wanted to mark it and see if we could strike the right balance between a kind of somber recognition of this, but at the same time acknowledge that we've learned a lot and that we're a year in, and that there are all sorts of ways in which we can take this extraordinarily tragic experience and convert it into some kind of lasting change and in meaningful kinds of ways that we live our lives, create community, earn our livings, and celebrate our sort of shared lives together as people who live in cities. Toronto is where the Canadian Urban Institute has historically been based, but it now has partners and staff and volunteers across the country. So it's increasingly becoming, true to its name, the Canadian Urban Institute. Toronto is the traditional territory of a number of First Nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Wendat peoples, the Haudenosaunee. And it's covered by several treaties, as people know, the Williams Treaty and the Treaty 13. We have at CUI been on a journey with all of you, and appreciating all of us working together collaboratively to look at the exclusionary legacy of city building. It's a colonial pattern of development that has continues to be manifested in the way that we construct and plan and design cities. And how do we deal with that legacy? How do we redress it? How do we do things differently? And here we also are at a time when climate change and all the kinds of environmental constraints and pressures that have been placed on us manifest in this extraordinary global pandemic. So I wouldn't say that tackling urbanism is for the faint of heart. I think it's for people that get the benefits and appreciate the possibilities that shared life is making possible for us, but also appreciating that a problem in a city is work that still needs doing, that this is a great endeavor to create livable, resilient, and just urban communities. And that's part of why we're so appreciative of having people come on as they have today into City Talk, into this session, and all the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of folks that have volunteered with CUI, supported CUI, funded CUI as a charity, and just thrown their cognitive surplus and capacity and energy and commitment to share, and for us to create the kind of connective tissue learning platform so that we can hear all the important things that are happening, good, bad, ugly, what's working, what's not, and what's next. So we're very appreciative to have with us this gang, Christy, Abby, Mansib, and Leigh, coast to coast, pretty much, although I think Atlantic Canada is going to start emailing me saying, how come we're not on? Listen, Atlantic Canada, just let us know you want to be on. We'll put you on. We know you're there. We use the chat function here for people to identify and sign in, which lots of people are doing. The other thing I'm going to suggest, if you can, through the broadcast, we're trying to highlight what the lessons are. And we're interested to hear from you what your lesson is. And that can be a highly personal lesson. Don't write us a PhD thesis in the chat, but just as the hour goes on, just share with us what you think the one lesson is that you're taking away from this experience, recognizing we're only a year in, and probably 5 years from now, you'll come back and say, oh, well, actually, there were these lessons. I was reflecting in my own experience. I was in New Orleans for 5 or 6 years after Katrina, and a year after, I would have been hard pressed to really come up with the valuable lessons. They took a while to manifest, you think, and then they change. But for now, moment in time, March 11, 2021, just write a little sentence there about what you think the lesson is for you. And in terms of your community or in terms of your own life, that's fine. You decide the scale you want to respond on. And just keep in mind that we videotape these, and meaning that you can rewatch them, and you can send them to your friends. They get posted, and so does the chat. We've had all sorts of extraordinary exchanges, information, resources, shared in this chat. And so we really appreciate that those of you that just work it, use the chat, exchange, and learn from each other. We also put the bios of each of the participants for City Talk up there so that we don't take as much time reading them out. And I'm going to just start with Kate Graham, who is our senior fellow at CUI and has been the shepherdess. Can I say that? I don't know whether it's a gender neutral term. The shepherd of marking every 100 days. And what could we watch? What were we observing? What were the patterns? What could we start to spot? I think that all of the work that we've been doing at CUI over the last year with so many of you is about watching, paying attention, looking around us to see what we can actually see. And the platforms that we created, City Watch, City Share, and City Talk, are all about paying attention. So Kate has been our paying attentioner for these 100 days. And here we are at 365. And she's going to take us through the sort of highlights of the report, pose a few questions, which we'll all engage in. And then I'm going to come to each of the four and ask them a little bit about what they've been up to as they've been coming to terms with what they were seeing. So over to you, Kate. Nice always to have you on the City Talk platform.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Mary, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. I don't know about you, but like it feels to me like this has been 10 years, and then sometimes it feels like COVID has been 1 month. But the fact remains that today marks the 365th day, the 1-year mark since the World Health Organization declared COVID a global pandemic. And as Mary said, at the Urban Institute, we have been trying to very thoughtfully and carefully stop periodically through this experience and read the signs, take a look at what we are learning. There are things we know and things that we don't know, but important markers for where we need to head as a country and the things that we should be most concerned about. So I am pleased to be here on behalf of the team that's put together a report called COVID 365 that was released by CUI this morning. And I'm going to walk you through some of the highlights of that report today, hopefully as a launching point for the discussion that we have ahead. So you saw here, also 365 days is too long for me to not be better at Zoom yet, but we're working on it. So you saw in the title slide, and we're seeing these in the headlines, we're hearing these numbers so concerningly. The loss of life over the last year has without question been catastrophic. Here in Canada, as of yesterday's numbers, 22,335 lives lost to COVID. Almost 900,000 Canadians have been sick, but the lives of the 35 or 36 million Canadians, for all of us, there has been an impact. And in addition to the tragedy of this experience, I think one of the most important things for us to reflect on is what these numbers tell us about the current state of our country and our world. So this has not been an experience where it's just random luck of the draw in terms of who has been sick and who has passed away. More than 15,000 of the deaths in Canada have been older adults above the age of 80, many of whom living in long-term care. We know that the effects have disproportionately been borne by racialized communities, by women, by people living in poverty. And it's because we live in a country where these inequalities existed long before COVID, where people who worked in jobs where they had higher risks have had a worse experience over the last year, where people who have less access to healthcare, to income stability, have also borne a disproportionate amount of the effect of this virus. And so in addition today, as we mark this National Day of Observance to mourning the loss of life, I think it's also really important that we thoughtfully think about what are the concerning and deeply troubling things that we're learning about our country that we need to be addressing going forward. So we've been producing these reports at CUI throughout this experience at the 100-day mark, the 200-day mark, the 300-day mark, and then today at the 365. And the punchline has been much the same. As an organization interested in cities, the data has been clear from day one that this, like past pandemics, has been an urban crisis. Our 20 largest cities represent 42% of our population, but far more than that, 62% of our cases and 64% of our deaths. But as the report, if you take a look at it, highlights, the experience of what that's looked like has been a little bit different in each city. So in the Day 100 report, cities like Montreal and Quebec City were off the charts, and by a long shot, the most concerning outbreaks and experiences with COVID. And over the last 100 days or the last 65 days, we've seen cities like Edmonton join that list. So it's been a very uneven experience, but one where we know cities across the country as a whole have been really hard hit by the COVID pandemic and the related crises. So in the report, we draw on a I think a pretty impressive data set put together by a company called Advanus, where they have surveyed 180,000 Canadians over the last year. And they decided to do this and make the data available free of charge on their website. And one of the things I'm most appreciative of is early on in the pandemic, they also decided to collect information like what city people are coming from, what racial or ethnic group they identify with, to help us better understand what the impacts have been. And so we draw on that data set throughout our series and in the report today. So what does the COVID experience look like? There are lots of ways of measuring this, but when Canadians are asked about their general mood, and this has been intensifying over the course of the pandemic, generally speaking, and not surprisingly, people are feeling a pretty healthy or pretty strong sense of despair. The feeling that I don't know when this is going to end, and what that will mean for my kids or my job or my school or my pocketbook or my business. Those feelings are very, very strong. But when you look at the other feelings that are presented, there are some differences that I think are important across cities. So a feeling of anger, there are a lot of people who feel like this is happening to them. People are overreacting, that they are maybe feeling angry towards government to a level that we should be paying attention to. Those feelings are also present in cities across the country, but in higher levels in some cities than others. We also know that the COVID crisis has led to a very significant economic impact. And this has once again been uneven. There was really interesting data released comparing the labor force numbers in February of 2020 to February of 2021. We just celebrated International Women's Day this week. And so I think it's worth noting that those numbers showed just how gendered the economic impact has been. 500,000 Canadian women have had to leave their jobs. 100,000 have permanently left the labor force, which is more than 10 times higher than men. And this has been especially hard for women with young children. 12 times more young mothers than young fathers have left the workforce. So the economic impact has been severe, but consistent with the message throughout this data, what we're seeing is that some of those existing inequalities are deepening. And that's certainly true along gender lines. So when asked about people's outlook on their own personal financial stability, and I think this is a really interesting indicator because it points to, for some people, it's about income. For some people, it may be about their business or about other factors. What we see is, generally speaking, people are feeling quite uncertain. That's the large number, some variation between cities. But generally speaking, people are feeling quite uncertain about what this will all mean for them in the long term in terms of their financial position. And when asked about household finances, we see that these effects not only are uneven across cities and across gender lines, but are also uneven across racial and ethnic groups. So for Canadians, for Filipinos, for Black Canadians, Indigenous people, the level of hardship, at least in this indicator, is twice as high as white Canadians. So we see that communities that are already experiencing some barriers have borne a disproportionate financial effect of this and are feeling more worried about how this will impact their personal family finances over the long term. One more data point that I just want to highlight from the report, and again, you can find lots more of these graphs in the report online, but is the impact that all of this experience is having on our mental health. And the message that jumps off the slide here is that the longer this goes on, not surprisingly, but very concerningly, the more significant the impact is that people are reporting on their mental health. I worry about how long this goes and at what point we may see these lines become even closer to one another. But these are the kinds of effects that will linger long beyond whenever COVID is done, whatever that means, and things that we need to be paying attention to because they influence many, many other parts of our society. So that all sounds very concerning, and it should. And this is a day where we are acknowledging loss of life and the hardship. But one of the things that we try to really emphasize in this report is that even in spite of all of this and this hard moment, A number of remarkable things have happened over the last year. So at a time when people needed to stay apart, what we have seen over and over and over again is communities coming together. And I bet every single person on this call could point to specific examples where you have seen this to be true. Sometimes it is small things, neighbors coming together to pick up groceries for one another. Sometimes it is transformative, very fast policy change that's happened across the country at a totally unprecedented pace. We have seen communities come together in our time of need, and today that is what we would like to celebrate. So the report, as Mary said, that we've shared includes the reflections of more than 100 people who have been a part of this ongoing discussion hosted by CUI over the last year about what we have learned. And I hope I see that a few of you are sharing in the chat what you've learned this year. This is a day where we've learned a lot about ourselves. We've learned about our country and our cities, and it's a day to reflect on those things. So we have shared some of these with you. These are all available online, and we'd encourage you to also share some of those observations and lessons that you've taken away from this year. The final thing I will note is that even though today is as Mary said, it's a somber day, we want to make sure today to be thanking the people who have stepped up. As I said, I bet every single person on this call, you can probably think of something that you have done that was extraordinary this year. Somehow, maybe you had to adapt. Maybe you had kids learning beside you while you were working. Maybe you made the time to reach out to someone who needed it. Maybe you have made pretty transformative changes in your work life, or if you are a healthcare worker, you've taken on lots of risk. A spoiler alert, the people you're going to hear from today on this call, we invited them because they are a group of people who have done some extraordinary things. And so today we want to reflect on where we've been this year, but also take a moment to say thank you to each of the many, many people who have stepped up this year to bring communities together and get us through this. This report at the end of the day is a way of, from CUI, us saluting you and saying thank you for how you've shown the resilience of urban Canada. So with that, I will stop and just say I really appreciate the chance for us to get together and talk today. And I am so looking forward to hearing from the inspiring speakers that we have, because each of them are great examples of exactly what we're talking about, people rising to the occasion, leading from where they are, and helping us get through what's been a very difficult 365 days.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks for all that you've done and for your household. In the middle of all this, Kate delivered a baby, just saying, and has a husband who's continues to be a city councillor. So that household has been all in on this. And I see that he's actually in the audience today. Thanks, Jesse. So we appreciate all that you've been able to contribute in between adjusting to your changing life, personal life. It is, as you suggest, a moment for us to kind of pause and just see if we can take stock. And that's what I know. If I were to take a question that I think is fielded to me regularly, most regularly, it would be, are these changes that we've made, that we've had to make, are they going to stick? Or are we just going to kind of swing back to the way it was? And so I'm interested generally, as we talk to our colleagues here, are things going to ever go back to the way they were? And the one sort of startling point that you underscored there, not only the racial piece, which is just staggering, and these are conditions my little phrase, the particle accelerator, things that pre-existed for COVID have just been made much, much more worse, much, much more visible. And so are we going to be able to take the steps we need to take to make these changes so that we are more resilient, so that we have a fairer allocation of resources, so that communities can recover themselves? And if we continue to do what we've always done, we're going to get what we've always got. And I think with that spirit of, can we push against the momentum that tends to swing the pendulum back to where it was? Can we keep pushing forward? So Christy, let's hear from you if we can. You're in sunny Edmonton. I hope it's sunny today.
It is.
You're always happy to have sun when you get it in Edmonton, I know. And Edmonton's a city that's struggling with its downtown. It's struggling with the future of the economy. You've got all sorts of, as we suggested, pre-existing things. We had a great week in Edmonton in December. Just so everybody knows, you can have a great week in December, particularly if it's virtual. It's not quite as cold. Trying to hear and learn all the things that you've been percolating there, and as part of the CUI local program, coming soon to a community near you. And Christy, we're keen to hear the interventions that you just spotted and how you stepped in. So describe for us the world you saw and how you engaged in it.
Thanks so much, Mary. Hi, everybody. Hi, all to all the listeners. I was, when it all hit, I didn't think, like, you heard what was happening in Italy. We heard what was happening around the world. And it was like, is it going to hit Edmonton the same way as it's hitting everybody else? And what happened, what the biggest piece for me was, we run an arts organization, Arts on the Ave. What happened was the Carrot Community Arts Coffee House, which is a social enterprise, started getting phone calls, Mary. And so what was happening was people started calling saying, can you help the kids? And when schools closed, all the food projects that were feeding the kids morning and afternoons and then snacks to go home stopped immediately. So all of our kids in our inner city core schools needed food. And that just hit me straight through the heart, saying, how do we do this? And so we started calling, we started a project called It Takes a Village. We started calling local bakeries. We started calling local grocery stores. And we, like, literally out in vans, driving out to get 30 dozen loaves of bread to bring into the community to just start feeding the people. The food and food security need has always been really huge in our neighborhoods. And all of a sudden, it just became that much more and that much more pronounced. We had actual signs on the roadway saying, if you need food, call the Carrot. Look for the helpers. We're one of those, call us. And we started networking and started connecting people. And Edmonton is a great city of people that want to help. And our team just stepped up and started bringing in food. I remember my husband and I sitting, just grabbing food because we were so tired. We had 30 dozen loaves of bread in our food truck, in our van. A guy comes by that had just used some kind of substance and said, hey man, can you give me something? And my husband looked at him and said, sure, what do you need? And he said, bread. Like, when have you ever heard a guy ask for bread? So he popped up the back of the van and just gave him loaves of bread. So we started then connecting families to families. We were like, how do we do this? And then how do we keep the spirits of our community that don't have internet? That was the other big thing in our core communities. Our neighbors, I live in Eastwood, Alberta Avenue District. They don't have internet. They rely on the libraries. They rely on other hubs. And so it was, how do we start sending messages out? So we started getting artists to just infiltrate the community with lanterns to bring hope, messaging on sidewalks, anything to start saying, we're here together, we're in it together, and you're not alone. And it just started a whole movement of getting to know your neighbors. And I think we always knew that we were isolated in these communities, and to see how we could do things and just start, like, we were busier than ever when everyone else was saying, our people are just taking a break. We were bringing our volunteers together. We have 700 unique volunteers to start helping out and bringing food and bringing support to our communities.
There's, I don't want to overly extract lessons all the time, but just hearing you, there are some sort of themes that I hear, like people suddenly realizing, oh, I have this capacity or I have this component that I could expand. I could do it a little differently. We heard these great stories about librarians. You probably heard them too, Christy. Librarians took their routers and put them to the windows.
Crazy.
So, you know what I mean?
Yes,
So people could get the
yes.
signal outside. All the ways in which, the one I'm going to go to next is Mansib, but how restaurants were the quickest to pivot in terms of figuring out how I don't know, but maybe food is a theme. Maybe it's because I'm a little hungry at the moment, but you know what I mean? Like, it's the great unifier, as you suggest. And we all seem to have that instinct that we all want to consume food, and can we share food? And these informal ways, I think this to me is one of the struggles. We've had a lot of improvisation and a lot of, we're going to do DIY it. And I sometimes worry that when we go to some other more organized time, that stuff will somehow, the rules will creep back. You know what I mean? Do you ever think about, are you thinking at all about what the future application of your piece is going to look like?
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. I think this organic movement of taking away and trying to eliminate the other is something that we need to make really pronounced in our society, because we are so siloed and we're all in our little spots and we see people come and go, but we always go, that's that person. And even the Families Helping Families program, I've had people saying, oh, I'll give you $2,000 to go buy groceries for those families, Christy. And I'm like, no, 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 it's your commitment to go grocery shopping and get the list from that family in need. And you go grocery shopping and you get to see them. You get to become friends with these wonderful people, and taking down that other. I found, Mary, like that is something, if we can accomplish it even to a small marginal piece, we're on the right trajectory. And I think that's something that, people are like, well, it's not going to happen, Christy, because people don't want to see those folks. And when I hear that, it just absolutely breaks my heart, because it just tells us where we are.
Although, as you suggest, various forms of social infrastructure can enable that and make it a little less scary, a little easier to do. And we used to have neighborhoods where there were places like that where you would meet the other. And over time, neighborhoods have become more segregated, more monocultural. So how do we now reinvent those new forms of connection so that you encounter the other? That's part of urban life, because you never know what your interaction is going to be with the other, and that's going to lead to something fantastic, right? That's why parks and all that stuff. Okay, well, thank you. Really interesting to hear from you. And as I said, we don't want to overdraw conclusions, but I do think there are little patterns of little signals, as Kate would say, that we can start to watch for and think, let's not lose that. Mansib, let's talk about the other side of food. And what you were watching. You come from the restaurant industry. Tell us a little bit about your background and tell us how you started to observe something that was needed to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we started our project Radish actually right before the pandemic, right? So we started at the end of 2019. It was an idea that, we've actually had for a couple of years. And basically what was happening, right, was in the restaurant industry, you had kind of these really big players like Uber and DoorDash and Skip that were coming in, right? They were kind of really changing the way that restaurants were being run and being operated. And, they're not the only ones, right? You have other technology platforms in restaurants such as, OpenTable or TripAdvisor, but the ones that everyone kind of know are the delivery platforms. And, we all talk about, everyone talks about the fees right now. They talk about how they take 30%, that, it's outrageous, et cetera. But the problem really goes deeper than that, right? The problem is that since these platforms have come in, consumers are getting, actually used to just ordering through these platforms rather than having the relation directly with the restaurant, right? Back in the day, well, I'm not that old, but I mean, even when I was younger, right, if you'd go to a restaurant and you'd have like a relation with your waiter or waitress, and you frequent the same restaurants, and more we hear, at least people from my generation, being like, yeah, let's order from Uber Eats tonight, right? Rather than let's order from our favorite restaurant, right? And it got to a point where even ourselves, we were doing delivery for a very long time with various restaurants, and it was always like kind of a break even or profitable business. It got to a point that was no longer possible, right? Because consumers would no longer order directly from the platforms. And not only that, but you wouldn't be able to hire drivers anymore, right? Because drivers were kind of, the first place they'd go to look for a delivery job would be the platforms, right? Rather than going and trying to go on Kijiji or whatever and trying to find the jobs, right? So we wanted to create an alternative platform that would be owned by the restaurants, and not just the restaurants, but also the drivers and consumers. Because the challenge with this industry, right, is everyone's kind of looking out for their own interests. Naturally, it's very normal, right? As a restaurant, you want to pay as less as possible. As a driver, you want to take home as much as possible and have as much stability as possible. And as a consumer, you want to pay as less as possible. So we wanted to create a platform that all three groups would kind of own. And so, yeah, we started that really at the start of the pandemic, right before. And the goal was really to kind of make it a hyper-local thing, right? Like, we're really thinking of like Main Street, thinking about, we have a restaurant on a major street, and we wanted to go to like 2-3 restaurants around us and like encourage them to kind of participate and just mutualize the delivery services through that, have a driver that we know by name, and that our customers would know as well. And what happened with the pandemic is all of a sudden, everyone kind of needed that service, right? And we needed it to kind of very, shift. And it kind of makes me think about what, you were talking about a bit earlier, which is that, or that Christy was talking about, which is that, there's a lot of kind of, I guess, like ad hoc solutions that we're coming up with now, but all of a sudden we have to make something that was kind of going to be sustainable and last beyond the pandemic, right? Because the problem is not the pandemic accelerates the thing, but it's much larger than that. And so yeah, and so then we formally create a cooperative. We decided to get work with the city to get financing and work with different, I guess, boroughs to offer the services to restaurants. And we've had a lot of support from the community, but most of all, we've had support from the members, right? So the restaurants themselves, contribute. Well, when they fund the project, right? They're the investors of the project, right? And that's also interesting because, again, when you have a platform like Uber and DoorDash, despite the fact that they kind of depend on everyone to become very, very large, at the end of the day, they really only benefit a few people, right? There's an outflux of capital and growth towards like a few firms or individuals. So now we're able to actually provide, restaurant owners with that, and not just them, but also drivers and consumers. And yeah, so I mean, basically our focus has been scaling that. So like we're around 25 or 30 restaurants in Montreal right now. We've had a lot of interest elsewhere in Canada, and we're trying to see how to go about that. Because the other thing to kind of keep in mind is we don't want to kind of we don't want to impose solutions on communities, right? The solution has to come from the community. So far, our drivers and consumers and restaurants are building that, but we don't want to take Radish and implant that. For example, we went to Saguenay. Saguenay invited us to come, present their project there, and their restaurants had totally different concerns, right? Because over there, the restaurants all knew their consumers directly, right? So the apps hadn't taken that kind of market share yet, and they're like, well, we don't want another brand to kind of come in and just be like a Trivago and kind of become interface, right? And also Radish is not representative of our community. We would prefer, maybe a more francophone name, et cetera. And so now we're trying to see like how do we kind of make this model replicable elsewhere. And the challenge is always, of course, balancing the kind of decentralized and centralized nature, right? Like one of the strengths of Uber is that again, wherever you go in the world, you can pull out the app and make an order, right? Whereas if you have like a different thing in every city, like all of a sudden, like the kind of consumers you get from like tourism or like for travelers, you would probably be harder to get that, right? Uber has an advantage there. Or you don't want to have to encourage a local community to spend, we spent like $20,000 on the legal stuff, right? Because the cooperative laws for this kind of project were really not established, right? You don't want to kind of have to, have every community kind of spend that much time and resources to get that done. So yeah, I'd say like, in summary, that's really been our focus is taking a solution that's from the community, that was kind of, issue from the community to deal with the community problem and try to make a formula that we can kind of provide to others and help them, inspire them to create their own projects.
Yeah, wonderful. I have this little allergy to scale or replication because I'm just hard at heart a localist. But both you and Christy are talking about an approach that other communities, if they knew about it, would say, "Oh, we can do it our way." Just like Abby Slater, one of our Super City talkers, is suggesting you don't want to call it radish everywhere. She's suggested call it legume, but I think you touched on something that lots of people started to observe in their communities when they realized that this was how they're going to keep their local restaurant going. They're going to find a relationship. And as you say, that intermediary, suddenly the delivery person that, as you suggest, is on a platform that's actually taking capital out of the community and benefiting some VC investors in California, just starts to irk you, doesn't it? It just starts to bug you, and then the restaurant is being disadvantaged. And so maybe both of you are getting at this piece about how do we as human beings, consumers, how do we exercise our own agency in how we spend our money and where it goes. And we got involved to put this Bring Back Main Street campaign together just to get people to start being thoughtful about what do you rely on your local neighborhood to provide for you? And if it isn't providing it, how does it now need to change to provide it for you? So just closing those gaps. And I want a new word. I'll put it out to the chat. Let's have a new word, not scale, not replicate, something that talks about how these Christy and Mansib's approaches can blossom. I don't know. So that it's not the same, but that that people learn from one another. And then, as you say, Mansib, it'll look like something different if it's in Anchorage or Kamloops or something. I'm going to go now to Leigh, who's got similar kind of challenge, I would think, because he's got a really hyper local, very strongly embedded approach, which is fantastic. And we all need to hear about it, Leigh, and hear about how you got to it. And then we'll think about how to, oh, good, the chat box, people are coming up with ideas. Variant, haha, okay, yeah, there's a variant need, a positive. We need a positive variant. Leigh, over to you in terms of what you've been putting together over at Aryze. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. First of all, thank you for having me. I'd like to say that early in the pandemic,
Just
sort
stop
of.
for a sec. Just stop. Terrific
Oh,
echo.
yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Is it only me, or are other people hearing an echo when Leigh speaks? Okay, what do we want to do about that? Jamie, any idea why Leigh is echoing? I'll let Jamie figure it out for a second. I'm going to go over to Abby. So Leigh, put yourself on mute, otherwise we're going to drive people crazy. And Abby, I'm going to come to you next while we figure out what happens. I did a thing yesterday, a celebration of Tim Jones' extraordinary career. I don't know how many of you were on it. And the beautiful musical guest could not get the audio to work 3 times, kept trying. So let's see if Jamie can troubleshoot with Leigh. Abby, over to you. Perfect example. You're a guy paying attention to what you're seeing and you're creating a tool. Talk about that experience, and then I bet there'll be other people that are going to come forward and talk about on the chat about how they've tried to adapt it. So over to you, Abby, from lovely Guelph.
Thank you. Even before the pandemic started, I think one of the defining characteristics of modern urban life is uprootedness. A lot of us move around. I came here from a different country 4 years ago. People move from a different city, a different neighborhood. And a lot of us, I think, sometimes find it difficult to find a sense of belonging and a cohesion with the place we call home. And these have just been, like Mary says, accelerated because of COVID, right? In part because our regular routines have been disrupted. And this sense of displacement has gotten just more profound and more pronounced through these lockdowns. So when COVID first started like a year ago, what I picked up on really was that through this sense of displacement, there was an outpouring of obligation. So it's not just outpouring of values, outpouring of intent, but an outpouring of duty and obligation and responsibility that many people felt towards a greater circle than just themselves. So my project over the last year has really focused on how do we take this natural, organic, massive outpouring of intent, duty, and obligation, and use that to connect to people's sense of belonging, a sense of place, and a place to call home. I first began by making a website to help volunteers connect with people who are looking to make masks, shopping for seniors in grocery stores, and et cetera. That was kind of an ad hoc thing, like some folks on the call already talked about. What I did not want to happen is for this outpouring to just dissipate over time due to lack of interest. So where I've taken that is that I've been using that as an opportunity to almost test and verify my own hypothesis, which is that home, your sense of home, is a habit. And belonging is an active practice. You can get better at belonging to places. I call 4 places my hometown. The way you do that, and this is something that has come out over my projects over the year, I challenge people in my community to walk around their town and take pictures of little libraries and send it to me so I can make a map so other folks can go out and spend time in their community. And what happens is, we have a physical space that we belong to. I live in Guelph in my apartment, and we have a social space that we belong to. I have friends with whom I share memories, values, and so on. What we need in order to build a sense of cohesion is for us to kind of merge those 2 things together. And the way you do that is not, you can't get up one morning and just go on like a Shakespearean rant and say, friends, countrymen, lend me your ears. I belong to Guelph. It has to come as habit forming. It starts small, and you build on those habits. And so I made a map of all the households in Guelph that were doing Christmas light decorations, in their words, for their community or for their city. I've made maps of restaurants that were offering takeout and stuff like that. And oftentimes when you talk to them, yes, there's our friend Mansib talked about the need to help connect businesses with local neighbors, but a lot of them feel a deep sense of doing this for their city and for their country. And by connecting people's need to belong to a place and giving them little habits, going out into their community, looking at their neighbors, asking like you were talking, Christy, about talking to their neighbors, understanding what their needs were, and responding to them organically, I have found over the year that, myself included, a lot more people have a greater sense of responsibility and a greater feeling of belonging and a greater sense of home. And then we can talk about giving back and we can talk about volunteering, and those paradigms have come and gone. But I think what we need to focus on in order to sort of crystallize this or not crystallize, perhaps not the right word, but to keep this a more long-term thing, is to talk about belonging and how we can nurture that and cultivate that through our individual practices and through city building and placemaking and so on.
God, you guys are all so bloody poetic and thoughtful. My God, I can see the chat box exploding, and we have people that do, students and interns that help us with takeaways, and you've just handed them these beautiful sentences, Christy and Mansib and Abby so far. It's all up to you now, Leigh. But I just want to reinforce this notion of home as a habit, belonging as a practice. Oh my gosh, I'm going to think about that. And also the three of you, again, this theme of making a connection, and what is the architecture that needs to be in place to assist us to make these connections. I wonder if we just have to make it as easy as possible for people to recognize that they have a role to play in belonging and in, I think lots of people don't really get that. They just don't have there aren't the mechanisms in place that required it of them, the responsibility you just suggested, Abby, right?
Can I squeeze in a quick anecdote, Mary?
Sure.
When I was young, growing up in India, middle class, urban India, we had rolling blackouts every day. We didn't have power for 6 hours a day. And I had a teacher who told me that the most patriotic thing you could do is to turn the lights off when you leave the room and pick up the trash when you saw it, right? Now, patriotism has a different relationship in India than Canada and so on. But what she was getting at was really that to reflexively and habitually develop this habit of thinking of your obligation, even while you're doing tasks that are little. So as you develop these habits of thinking, I'm turning the light off for my country, I'm picking the trash up for my city, those habits will inculcate in you a sense of obligation for the place that you call home.
And also that you can make a contribution, because I do think there's a certain element of helplessness that people experience. My version of that, Abby, is that I feel we should all remove the passwords on our wireless so that everybody can use our wireless. That's my version. Okay, Leigh, with great trepidation and with fingers crossed, I'm going to mute myself and you're going to unmute and tell us your story.
I am unmuted. How am I sounding?
You sound hot. Is what I think that's what they call it in the business. You're hot, but I think people can hear you. We're going to stick it out. Go for it.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me, to both Mary and Kate. Early on in the pandemic, in sort of May of June of last year, these City Talk series were a bit of a lifeline for me, actually. And something that Mary said in one of those early episodes was the word subsidiarity, and the way that relates to pushing things to the local. And I think that is sort of an undercurrent in everything that's been said so far today. So to sort of bring that to our story, specifically here in Victoria, so I'd like to start out just by introducing Aryze, which is the company that I work for here. It is a home builder. It's a real estate developer. Started out as a custom home builder several years ago, and as time has gone by, it's sort of morphed into something that's much more community focused, that's much more sort of thoughtful. I know it's an overused word, but it's basically a group of people from diverse backgrounds that bring something different to the table and tries to not shy away from our relationship with the community. We know that we don't operate in a void. We know that everything we do is taking place in a place that's made up of people. It's made up of relationships, made up of places, but those physical places are only there because of work and care and love that's taken place before us. So it was from this starting point that we approached our project, Hey Neighbor, which is a transitional tiny home community. It's 30 sea cans, shipping containers, that we're fitting out to be homes for people who have been living on the street throughout this winter, throughout the pandemic. And basically, it's a reaction to a need, a grave need here in Victoria, which was apparent from the early days of the pandemic. There was a massive increase in people living on the street. It's always been a problem. It's always been present in Victoria. I mean, I was born and raised here, so it's not strange for us at all. But I do think that COVID has forced people who maybe would have just turned a blind eye, maybe seen it as something that was beyond any hope of solving. Now those same people are sort of looking at it as something that we need to solve. So as home builders, we approached the problem in the only way we really knew how, which was to build homes. And that's what we're going about doing. And in this process, these homes were paid for, they've been crowdfunded. So we needed to raise $500,000 to build 30 homes. We did it in just over 3 months. And through this process, I think that the most interesting aspect is the learning experience that we've had in seeing people's relationship to the city. I think that what Mary just hit upon, the feeling of helplessness, we've all felt helpless during COVID, obviously. Whatever small semblance of control we may have had over our larger milieu, our larger sort of surroundings in our lives has mostly evaporated, and everything's kind of shrunk down to be very small. And I think that this project that we've had with Hey Neighbor has given people an outlet for that helplessness, and they've had now a pathway. They've had a prescripted thing that they can do. They can, go click this link and donate some money, and you will actually see this concrete difference being made in your hometown. And I think that the broader conversation around that is that feeling of helplessness is not just because of COVID. It's something that's been a pandemic of sorts in our cities for a very long time. And I think that that's what we really are trying to address is we need to ask ourselves, why do our cities make us feel helpless? Why do we feel like we can't make a difference on a day-to-day basis? We need to create frameworks that are local and that allow people to participate and see meaningful change happen in real time, as it were. And yeah, it's just been a fascinating experience to learn about ourselves, to learn about others, to learn about the way that people see each other.
It's great. Thanks, Leigh. I'm going to suggest you mute again because you're as I said, you.
Oh, sorry, Mary. I can't hear you.
You can't hear me. Can other people hear me? Okay. There's something about the audio connection there. He's muted himself anyway. We always publish transcripts from this, so we'll make sure that, now Leigh is unmuted. I'll leave it to Jamie to there we go. We always publish transcripts, so if you had trouble hearing Leigh because he was just a little dominant in your audio register, we'll make sure you get to read what he said. What I so appreciated about this is that Leigh is making this part of his work. And others here, Abby, I know you're probably familiar with this term cognitive surplus, which I'm kind of in love with, which is this idea that technology now gives us ostensibly extra bandwidth in our brains so that we have time to do something off the corner of our desks or in the evening. And I think this together, everybody recognizing that we have some way to engage. And either part of our day job and it morphs. I think of municipal workers. We've done lots of work with municipalities. Kate used to work for one, the City of London, and we now have relationships with various municipal governments and their staffs across the country. And we're aware that the municipal worker is the chief improviser when it's come to responding to COVID. They had to suddenly figure out how to get portable washrooms into parks, or how could they create streets that were no longer had as much traffic, or could they figure out how they could actually create a safe space for people that would normally shelter in a particular environment and couldn't get access to it, or how were they going to address safe supply for people that were living in certain kinds of circumstances and accustomed to certain kinds of assistance. And all of that has had to be made on the fly remarkably quickly without anybody spending 10 seconds saying, is that my job? It's kind of the version, Christy, of, well, I don't know that person. We've somehow had to just roll our sleeves up and get into it. So as we imagine a year from now, the next 12 months, I want to just go quickly around to each of you and ask you, what do you think the focus is going to be for you in terms of what are you going to double down on? Or who else do you think needs to join you in doubling down? Kate, I'm going to go to you first. Doubling down, COVID, 700, and I can't do the math, to get us to year 2.
Sure. Well, the big story for me has been a pretty rude and tragic awakening about inequality in our society. We all sort of know this, but I think this year it's become painfully apparent. And so I hope this is a year, and I'm committed to making sure this is true for me included, is to think about the spaces and places where each of us have influence and where those inequalities exist, and doing everything that we possibly can to level that playing field, whether it's in your workplace or in the team that you're in or within your classroom or in a club that you're a part of, whatever. These inequities exist all around us. And I think all of us have a lot more power than we think we do to address them. And so I don't want to leave the onus on others who may not experience privilege that I have to rip those barriers down. I want to be a more deliberate, conscious part of building a more equal Canada and more equal cities across the country.
So let me just ask you a very specific question. Rules. There are rules that are impeding municipalities across this country. What would you do if you had to change one?
Is it because you already know what my answer is?
You heard it here first, Kate Graham.
So I think our form of federalism has for a long time prioritized federal and provincial governments, and the scale of government that I think affects the quality of life the most is at the local level. We see huge variation and diversity in cities across the country, and I would like to see cities have more power to do things that improve the well-being of or the livelihood of everyone in their community, appreciating that means something quite different in each city. So more power for cities.
Power for cities. Thank you. A couple of thumbs up. I just want to mention that Leigh is a graduate of Concordia. Could you hear that little Concordia stream going in his narrative? I could hear it. Mansib, what about you? Do you have something you're going to double down on and focus on? And is there a rule that you'd like to see changed, maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, or at least our team and our communities, it'll be the repatriation of our platforms, our tools, our data. Right, a lot of the ownership of like infrastructure that is like really vital, for us to kind of, even make a living, right, is in the hands of people or institutions that are, forget the city, right, or not even, in the country or maybe not even in the continent, right. So I think that's, that has made it very difficult for, a lot of us here to kind of adapt because again, when we would need, certain considerations of like how we do business locally, the platforms or the tools or the data governance or whatever that we're kind of used to, was not able to adapt because it's kind of global. So yeah, I'd say like in regards to doubling down, it's that. In regards to rules, I'd say for us specifically, I'd say rules around alternative forms of governance, right? Like the cooperative rules here, were great for the longest time. We've seen like a lot of big co-ops come in the history of Canada, but recently that's been a lot of challenges because the rules haven't been adapted, right? We've seen that with, for example, Mountain Equipment Co-op, where because the rules were not, the laws were not kind of looked at as often, when they kind of closed down, we didn't, what happened was not something that we would expect, right? The members did not get their say. Or in our case, right, we weren't even able to open our co-op for 9 months because of various reasons, like, just simple things like you're not able to create, you have to physically meet in person to create a co-op, right? All the founders, the 5 founders, physically.
Crazy.
Yeah, and so we got a derogation to become the first co-op, at least in Quebec, to be able to constitute over Zoom, right? So that's something that took several weeks. And
crazy though, eh?
Yeah, and then it's across the board, right? There's everything from like securities laws, there's things like data, et cetera, that need to kind of be looked at. So I'd say that's would be important from our perspective.
The connection you're making with Kate is that if we pulled these things down to the local, If we had more authority at the local level, if we had more capacity to make these decisions at the local level, you would not have these layers and layers of layers of resistance. And new forms of ownership, who owns what? You know, do we have to own things singly? Can we own things commonly? What does that look like as we have this moment, don't we, to really reimagine that? So your initiative is a perfect example, but applicable to a whole bunch of other domains, not just getting food delivery sorted out. So appreciate that. Leigh, if you had one thing, one rule you'd like to change, one thing you're going to double down on, what would it be?
Well, I think that as home builders, one rule we'd like to change would be, if we identify a need for housing in a given area, then we can build it by right. And if the need is truly there, then it should be just as simple as saying, hey, we need it. Someone who's going to build it should be done. But that's obviously a pipe dream.
I was going to say, Leigh, if you could tackle that and deal with NIMBY and all the kinds of complicated things. But again, if you made that as local as you can, so the local municipality is in a role to be able to actually enable those decisions. Victoria has lots of struggle around this. We know the mayor is trying to make neighborhoods as diverse as she can, right?
Definitely. We've been very lucky to have some really progressive and proactive leadership for the last few years. And we've had an amazing cooperation with multiple levels of government for the Hey Neighbor project. We definitely couldn't be doing it without that cooperation and that support. But again, as you say, like maybe that kind of cooperation and support will cease to be expected.
Leigh, stay on the positive. Maybe this is the moment for subsidiarity to win. Abby, I'm coming over to you, Abby. What's the one thing you're going to double down on? What do you think? Is there a rule you want to see changed? Go for it.
I'm just going to double down on my own goofiness. Like, you know, I don't think of myself. I don't think of myself as an urbanist. You know, I'm just a guy who makes goofy maps. You know, I love my city. You know, I have very modest goals like that. And I don't know about a rule, but I think one operating philosophy that I think cities could change is to not focus so much on one, you know, large project, but how do you unlock everyday habits of people and allow for more activities so that people can develop that habit of home bringing. We all have that need. You know, everyone who's moved to a different city knows that they want to belong. Everyone wants to call their city their home. And what municipalities, I think, and other artists of government need to do is to just allow people to be not focus on one big building where community building happens, but it happens on street corners, it happens in restaurants, it happens everywhere. To get into the mindset of, you know, continuous progress and incremental progress, little by little, focusing on everyone and letting people do what they're already good at, what they already want to do, I think would be a phenomenal change. And I would encourage everyone to just activate your goofiness and pay active attention to your community, listen to what's going on, and look within and find your own goofy talent and apply it to help people find their home.
Act on your goofiness. Thanks for giving us permission on that, Abby. I'm going to come to you last, Christy, and I'm struck by where we started, which was acknowledging our ancestral traditions and the territories in which we all reside, and how, as I listen to Abby, who's a newcomer, and I think of how urban Canada has been constructed from the ground up by newcomers, but it also has a huge challenge around reconciliation with Indigenous people that long predate us in these communities. So this is not an easy task, but it's a question of seeing the other, isn't it, Christy? And how do we create a new kind of social contract with all of the others of which we are? What's your one thing you're going to focus on?
Oh, that was beautiful, Mary. I love the goofiness, Abby. I think that is where we need to start, is who we are as real people. And I think that's for me, like being able to be, I call it a ta-da, like being able to try something. And if it doesn't work, you're going, ta-da, we tried it, right? And that's okay. And it worked, or it didn't work, or some of it worked, or we're going to never do that again, right? So I think that to me is creating more ta-das and allowing yourself the ability to be goofy and fun and love each other. I mean, love is a decision, right? It's a verb. It's not about just sitting to, like, if you're just sitting in a relationship and never doing anything, it's not going to grow. And that's the same thing with our urban life. It's the same thing, like, the nodes, the back alleys. I mean, our city, they really changed quickly to patios on the streets. It would have taken me as a coffee house forever to have got a patio on the street. All of a sudden it was done like that. Or bathrooms, like we have been debating bathrooms, outdoor bathrooms forever. And all of a sudden we spoke to the right guy, and he was like, yeah, we got money, we got a bathroom, we had people watching the washrooms, so it was properly used, and it was great. But now we're sort of going back now, as everyone's like, well, do we do this or not? And it's like, of course we do. Everyone needs a bathroom. Like that's just our normal practices. We need to let someone be able to go to the washroom with dignity. So I think those are things that we just need to find ways to have fun, live life to I guess in an abundance way, right? As opposed to that scarcity, and not being afraid, right? Fear stops us. And I think we just keep powering through in love and confidence that we're doing it together, and allowing ourselves to have a ta-da moment if we need to.
Or a few ta-da moments.
Yeah, several maybe.
Yeah, I mean, we're, as Kate said, she showed that hashtag in it together. I mean, everyone has experienced COVID differently, depending on your circumstance, depending on where you live, depending on what your means were. But now we are in some kind of a collective re-examination. Can we emerge from this in a new kind of way? So I just want to thank Christy and Abby and Mansib and Leigh for coming on, sharing with us your experiences, and Kate, as always, for the insights you've brought to us. And for Gary Offenberger, who's at Advantis, who has been our great in-kind partner, providing this remarkable data, 180,000 Canadians responding. Again, part of that engagement. How do we hear where people are actually at, meet people where they're at, and engage together. I also just want to say, just last minute on City Talk, thanks for all the people that have tuned into City Talk over the last year. We kind of dreamt this up. We're really appreciating how engaged people have been. CUI is a charity. This has been made possible by partners and funders and supporters and city talkers, and also just remarkable staff and volunteers. CUI is a big collective effort of people that are remunerated and people that aren't, cognitive surplus people and people who are adjusting their day jobs. So I just want to acknowledge all of them, and who have been part of this, and who continue to be committed to that. And we are going to think at CUI about what our next trajectory is, and what are the rules that we think need to change, and how do we double down on what really matters. And on the 22nd of March, we're going to be back with Jay Pitter for a fantastic launch of her Engaging Black People in Power publication. It's a really important resource that's highlighting engagement practice and policy approaches for addressing spatialized anti-Blackness in cities. That's some real work, folks, that we all have to do. And there are a number of people that are coming into that engagement. You'll see it announced shortly by us on the website, and we encourage you all to come. It includes acknowledging Mitch Silver, who's the Commissioner of Planning, Parks, in New York City, and then a number of other advocates, Anthony Taylor, a memorial to Daryl Gaston, who was an activist in Raleigh, sadly died, and also a fabulous playlist. It's even got a playlist. Look, we're getting good on this. We're getting a playlist from Sam Carter-Shamai. So that's on the 22nd of March. And then we'll have continued programming, because as I've said, and I always quote Jane Jacobs, a problem in a city is work that still needs doing. So let's get busy. Thanks everybody for joining us on this COVID 365 City Talk. And I hope we'll continue to share with our colleagues and our friends why this moment matters and what we're learning. Thanks everybody.
Thank you.